out the truth of what's really happening. I wanted to start off with all the different numbers that are out there. Obama is leaving office right now, and we see the unemployment is at 4.6%. Initial jobless claims, well, it's at the lowest point in 43 years. From all of your research and everything that you've been looking into, are these numbers actually the true numbers?
Well, a lot of it's a matter of definition, and the other's a great deal of interpretation. In terms of let me hit the simplest first, which is the low level of new claims for unemployment insurance. I contend the economy never really recovered and actually started to turn down again in at the end of 2014. What you've seen here has been an extraordinary economic downturn that started probably late 2006. You saw that with in the construction trade and began to spread. And the formal recession hit the end of 2007. The economy formally collapsed into 2009, worst collapse we've seen since the Great Depression. And if you believe the government numbers after that, you had a sharp economic rebound where the gross domestic product adjusted for inflation, the real numbers as they call them, now are strongly above, at least 10% above where they were at the peak of the prior economic cycle. But you're not seeing that in any major economic series. Many are still below their peaks of the prior cycle. Even employment's only up 5% or such. And there are a lot of problems with the employment numbers. But in terms of the new claims, big issue here all along has been as the economy hit hard, companies started to lay people off. They cut back on their fat. They got down to their basically core employment. And once you're there, there's not too much more laying off that you do. And you're cutting into you're beyond the muscle, you're cutting into the bone, it becomes self-destructive. And I'll contend that a lot of what you see now in the low level of new claims is that you just don't have as many people being laid off as you used to because the level of fundamental, the level of employment is not as comfortably cushioned as it was before the crash. The other issue is that those numbers are just worthless week to week, particularly around holidays. They've never found a way to seasonally adjust for that. So you get around Christmas time or New Year's Eve or Thanksgiving, those numbers jump all over the place, and what you see one week will tend to reverse the next week. I don't think it's a particularly good quality series. In terms of the unemployment rate being so low, there's an absurdity there that is tied directly to definition. And a definitional change here was made back in 1994. They overhauled the whole series, unemployment reporting series, in anticipation of impact from what was then the NAFTA trade agreement coming into effect. And the effect there was that they expected and knew there were going to be a lot of jobs lost offshore. You'd have plants shut down in towns where those jobs might not be quickly replaced, and so they moved to redefine what they call the discouraged worker. People wanted to work. They went out and actively worked, but couldn't find a job, and eventually gave up looking for work. But they still wanted to be employed. The headline numbers that you get, the headline unemployment, and this is the definitional end, the one that's is down at the moment down below 5%, but you have the Fed arguing that, oh my goodness, 5% traditional full employment. I'll get to that in a minute, but what you're seeing there, where it hit the headline number hit a peak of 10% at the worst of the formal recession, is that if you're counted as unemployed, you have to have been actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks. If you haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks, you'll be counted as a discouraged worker and moved out of the headline employment numbers and be counted as a year in a broader measure they call U6. The headline unemployment number is U3. The U6 includes the discouraged workers. People discouraged for a year, they haven't been looking for work because there are no jobs to be had. But after a year, they're no longer counted as in any of the formal unemployment measures. Before 1994, there was no time limit on being discouraged. If you were a displaced worker and you'd given up looking for work, but were still, looking for work if it were available, you'd still be counted as a discouraged worker. So that what happened here is that through much of the cycle and the so-called recovery here, there are two ways that unemployment drops. The happy way that the unemployment rate declines from 10% to 4% is that or 5% is that people who are unemployed become reemployed. They gain jobs. Employment grows. And that's with the normal business cycle what you see. But the unemployment rate also can decline if the unemployed are defined out of the labor force and they're no longer counted as unemployed even though they don't have jobs. And that's what's been happening here. The unemployment rate simply is the number of unemployed divided by the headline labor force. The labor force is the number of employed plus the number of unemployed. And if you reduce the number of unemployed because they haven't been looking for work, the unemployment rate drops. And a great deal of the decline in the unemployment rate here has been due to people giving up looking for work. The U6 rate initially was up to about 17%. But now with the jobs that even there after a year, if you're a discouraged worker, you get defined out of existence after a year. So even the U6 rate has come back down. It's still around 10% as opposed to the headline number that's a little shy of 5%. I have what I refer to as an alternative measure where I estimate the long-term discouraged workers, the displaced workers, including going back to before 1994 and reworking the numbers from that point on. I've got an unemployment rate right now, it's a little shy of 23%. Again, you can define these numbers any way that you want. I would contend that if you went around and asked the average person in the United States whether or not he or she was unemployed, you'd end up with an unemployment rate close to mine. And people will tell me, oh my goodness, that's up around, in the Great Depression, the unemployment got up to 25%, we're pretty close to that. That's not completely comparable because back in the Great Depression, somewhat over 20% of the population or the workforce was on farms, and today it's less than 2%. So if you looked at the non-farm unemployment, I mean, people even had families on farms. People go live with their people, with their cousins who had farms during the Great Depression. So that's where the 25% unemployment rate was. If you look at the non-farm unemployment rate in the Great Depression, it's estimated peak level about 35%, and I think that's a reasonable comparison to my number. We're well shy of that. It's as bad as we've seen since the Great Depression, but it's not that much worse than you've seen in some of the big economic declines we had in mid 70s or the early 80s.
I wanted to move on to GDP, and we know throughout Obama's term he didn't get a quarter above 3% until last quarter. Right before the election, all of a sudden GDP went up to like 2.9%, then it was revised to 3.5%. And when you look at the GDP numbers, do you believe that the last figures that are out, that we actually hit 3% GDP? And actually, what is the real GDP number?
Well, I contend the real GDP number is flat. Again, if you look at the formal GDP, the economy collapsed into 2009 and then just basically rebounded, kept going higher and higher and higher, and it's well above its pre-recession high. That's due to two factors. One, the GDP series has been redefined in the last couple of decades to add in all sorts of defined niceties that are purely theoretical, but the average guy doesn't see them from a meaningful standpoint in terms of economic activity. For example, adding in intellectual properties. Big changes in the GDP due to the fact that the U.S. television network imported intellectual property from Brazil with the Rio Olympics. You have a movie, you put a long-term value on it, they plug it into the GDP. You take away all that nonsense here and a number of underlying assumptions that have been altered over time, that knocks a lot of the headline GDP growth out of there. But putting that aside, there's a major problem with inflation. And inflation has been redefined over the years. One of the factors is what they call hedonic quality adjustments. And what's done there is if a product goes up in cost, it could be due to inflation, or maybe there have been quality changes that are measurable and that have upped the cost of the product, and you need to adjust for quality. And that's a legitimate issue. There are quality adjustments here that are very difficult to measure. And again, they've introduced a computer modeling to estimate them. The average person doesn't see these issues. For example, going back in time, one of the early examples was government mandating new emissions reformulations for gasoline. And what it did when this particular formulation was mandated and went into effect was it added 10 cents per gallon to the cost of gasoline. Now, the average person didn't recognize that extra 10 cents as being, oh my goodness, I'm getting more, I'm getting better quality air because of this. They're moaning and groaning as they fill their tank to go to work. The gasoline's costing them more. And that's, nonetheless, the government didn't put it into the CPI, it didn't get into the headline inflation numbers, although they later retrenched and reversed that. The concept is there with a lot of issues where the government determines that there's a quality improvement, but the person who's buying it doesn't have an option in terms of not buying that quality improvement. And as a result, nonetheless, the headline inflation number is reduced. Well, the GDP, as it's reported, is adjusted for inflation. And if you overstate inflation, you artificially depress the real GDP, the inflation-adjusted GDP. And if you understate inflation, you artificially boost it. Well, with the introduction of these hedonic quality adjustments, making adjustments, for example, to computers, the effect there was to artificially reduce the GDP implicit price deflator, the GDP inflation measure, boosting economic growth. And when the United States did this, other countries such as Germany and Japan didn't follow us, at least not right away. It was even discussed in the president's annual economic report. You know, boy, my goodness, we're boosting GDP by reducing inflation here. Well, yeah, over time, the difference now is that you're seeing about an artificial reduction of 2 percentage points in the GDP, which means that the GDP is overstated by about 2 percentage points after inflation adjustment. And if you knock out those understatement of inflation, what you find is that the GDP, instead of rebounding from its crash into 2007, basically has been flat. And we're seeing that in a number of areas, ranging from some elements in industrial production to the housing market. We've had an generally increasing trade deficit. I'll come back to them, but just getting back to that GDP number for a moment. By changing the way the inflation was calculated, the U.S. all of a sudden was showing stronger economic growth than countries such as Japan and Germany on a relative basis, as to what had been shown before. Germany and Japan initially didn't change their deflation methodology, so that this period of protracted weak growth that was seen, for example, in Japan, largely was due to just how people were deflating their numbers and just utter nonsense. And so the GDP is the most worthless of series, even though it's the most widely followed. It's been heavily manipulated over time. You go back to the days of Lyndon Johnson, and he was noted at the time he would review what was then that was referred to as the GNP, the gross national product, which is a broader measure than the GDP. He would review that every quarter, and if he didn't like the number, he'd send it back to the Commerce Department, and he'd keep sending it back to them until they got it right. I have that from a fellow who worked in the Commerce Department at the time. At least, this is back in time a little bit. But there have been direct manipulations. I can tell you that in the days when the first George Bush was president, the economy was in recession. And this is in the 1990 recession.
John, do you believe that we're in a recession now?
Oh, yes. We've never recovered, and I'll contend the economy's turning down. But there was a time when the numbers are manipulated, and you talk about the third quarter, that's not going to hold over time, although they're playing all sorts of games with the numbers. Main Street USA has a pretty good sense of what's really going on, and the average guy will vote his pocketbook. That's why Trump won the election. Trump realized and recognized that the economy was not as advertised, that the average person was hurting financially. And that's what he parlayed into his victory. And when the numbers were manipulated back in the days of George Bush, Bush lost to Clinton. It didn't make any difference. Clinton said, the economy's stupid, and Bush was right on that. It's an issue that, as we look at today, my contention is the GDP, the broad economy, started to turn down again in December of 2014. There was some recovery off the bottom in the middle of 2009, but it never got back to its pre-recession high. And where you can see that very simply is you look at at industrial production. Industrial production is published by the Federal Reserve. It's adjusted for inflation, and it accounts for over 60% of the gross domestic product. Now, if you look at the official headline reporting there, and the Fed can play games with its numbers too, but not as much as the Commerce or Labor departments do. The industrial production actually had 1 month of recovery, where it got above its pre-recession high. That was in December of 2014. As a 1 month blip upward, the next month it fell back below its pre-recession high, and right now it's a couple of percentage points below its pre-recession high for the 2007 recession. If you look at manufacturing, which is roughly 80% of industrial production, it never recovered its pre-recession high, and it's 6% below its pre-recession high. How can you have 60% of your economy it's never recovered. Its pre-recession high and it's down 8%, or excuse me, 6% or more, while the GDP's up by it's over. I think it's over 10% now. It's just nonsense. You look at the housing market, the construction. You're down 25 to 50% from pre-recession peaks, depending on the measure. And that's I mean, there are overlaps between production and construction and other issues. You look at the retail sales, not adjusted for headline inflation. It's about 5% above its pre-recession peak. If you correct for overstated inflation, it's also down below its pre-recession peak. But in terms of official reporting, it's still well shy of the headline gain. Employment is broader measures you get on the economy, and again, there are all sorts of issues there, all sorts of games played. But again, you're not seeing any post-recession surge there that is anywhere as close to the GDP. The GDP is heavily overstated.
So from everything that you've been looking at, do you believe the economy is still headed in the direction where it is going to collapse, fall apart?
Well, I think it is falling apart, and you're going to see continued downturn. Now, we have a change in administration coming. Mr. Trump has recognized the economic problems, and he's promised some stimulus, and stimulus is good here. It'll help. There are a couple of problems, though. One is stimulus, either cutting taxes and or increasing government spending, will have positive impact on economic growth, but there's a lead time, roughly a year. It'll be early 2018 before you see impact from the stimulus measures, assuming we get enacted shortly after his inauguration. There will be there's going to be some short-term issues with the near-term budget deficit. There's some big problems there. Long-term, we have long-term insolvency at the moment in place in the U.S. for the U.S. government because of unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. And if you discount the liabilities, the obligations there, the net obligations for inflation, the cost of money, what do you need to have in an account today to cover that in the future? We're looking at a shortfall, net shortfall, well in excess of $100 trillion. That cannot be covered under any circumstance, shy of just printing the dollars to pay it off, which creates a hyperinflation. And the financial markets are concerned about that, had been concerned about that. That's going to become a refocus of the global markets, as I'm seeing it, as the deficit picks up a little bit on a short-term basis. So that's an issue that's got to be addressed, and that's a difficult one to address. And then you have the Fed that's impotent, they're befuddled. They're saying, "Oh my goodness, we got full recovery now. We can raise interest rates." Well, they did that. They did that back December of last year, and they did nothing but cry wolf for the next year. The economy is going to have them in a position they're not going to be raising rates for the near term and near term. And as the economy increasingly picks up to the downside, I mean, to the extent you had a little boost, artificial boost in that third quarter number, GDP number, you're already seeing a very sharp relative slowdown in the fourth quarter number. That's going to be out. You're going to be dropping into the second quarter of 2017. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the Fed to go back to quantitative easing. The quantitative easing does nothing to stimulate the economy. Never has, but they use that as political cover. We've got to stimulate the economy. They use that as political cover to provide liquidity bailouts to the banking system. And the banking system is their primary concern here. A weak economy puts solvency stresses on the banking system, and that they will address. So that we've got the Fed that's going to be backing off from their raising rates. You've got concerns over the budget deficit to be coming up. And this is despite the stimulative action to be hitting in 2018. And I think you're going to see that will negatively impact the dollar, which is going to give you very difficult markets before the middle of next year. Next year. That's current, forget we're in 2017, before the middle of this year.
So do you think with Trump in office, do you think he'll be able to turn anything around, or do you think that the economy will head into a depression during his administration and he'll have to weather the storm through all of this?
Well, if anyone has been given a mandate for change, he certainly has. I mean, he ran on change, and if he doesn't get it, presumably he can use that as a tool to lever the next congressional elections in his favor. Problem is he doesn't have that long. I don't think he's got till mid-year to make massive progress here before the markets start to fall apart on him. If the markets fall apart, that can do him a lot of things. So there's great danger there. I do think he's going to do his best to resolve it, and at least he's got tacit approval on fiscal stimulus, which will be helpful to the economy. The grave dangers ahead, and I still see a high risk of a hyperinflation down the road. Not that far down the road, so it's a time to be very cautious. I'd look at the looking at the risk of very high inflation, hyperinflation down the road, getting some assets into they're not already there in the physical gold, holding them there through the crisis. It is the ultimate hedge against a very bad inflationary circumstance.
John, you mentioned hyperinflation. When you're talking about hyperinflation, what exactly do you mean by hyperinflation? Like, what will people feel when hyperinflation hits?
Well, what they'll see initially is that prices are surging, and eventually the dollar will become worthless. You look at what happened in the German Weimar Republic, common comparison point, but that's when you have a hyperinflation, the currency gets debased, to print the money to meet obligations, and that's what Greenspan said. Hey, people raise risk. Oh, the U.S. is at risk of defaulting on its debt, and Greenspan said very simply, the U.S. will never default on its debt because its debt's denominated in dollars, and it has a printing press so it can print the dollars. Yeah, and that's what gives you full debasement of the currency. Back in the Weimar Republic, Germany, during the hyperinflation, you could go out and have a very nice dinner one night, have a very expensive bottle of wine, and the next morning that empty glass bottle of wine, it had been the bottle of wine, would be worth more as scrap glass than it had been worth as a full bottle of wine the night before. People going to have lunch, they'd negotiate their price before they sat down, because after they got up from lunch, price of lunch would be higher. It got to the point that people literally used paper currency for paper, wallpaper, toilet tissue, all sorts of things. That's a circumstance that we're not prepared for here. And we no longer have as much physical currency. A lot of it's electronic. I don't know how the electronic systems and the credit cards can adapt to this. It's going to be a very difficult time, and one where you want to have some hard assets in hand. Don't count on anything from anyone else. Again, physical gold gives you that primary hedge.
John, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it. Once again, how can people see your work?
Go to shadowstats.com. That's my website. Upper right-hand column, you'll see some public commentaries on things such as hyperinflation. I discuss the risks and how that's addressed. I'm in the process of updating all that. We also have a weekly newsletter. Actually, it's at least once a week. It's a commentary that's available electronically to our subscribers. But if you look in the left-hand column, you'll see the headlines from what we do, and it gives you an idea as to what we're looking at. We always welcome new subscribers. not really expensive. It's $175 a year, $89 for 6 months. Always happy to pick up new subscribers, but you'll find there's a lot on the website for people who are just looking for background information.
John, once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you again for having me.